Qué genius que soy yo, weón. Un
Did you
genio.
know in Metal Gear Solid 3,
Ah, sí, espérense, para los que no saben inglés, weón. Para los que no speaken English, aquí les explico en Spanish, weón. Ahí está. Y ahora lo pongo en restablecer y listo.
the scene where Volgin tortures Snake was meant to be interactive and a lot more violent? This is, of course, the moment Snake loses his right eye. In the game's final build, it's a 1-minute cutscene the player just watches passively, while Colonel Volgin electrocutes and punches Snake to find out how much the CIA knows about him. But, in a director's commentary published in a 2005 magazine, Kojima said that the whole thing was going to go on much longer. Eventually, we ended up cutting that back. We were also going to have an option as Snake was being tortured to have the player choose either yes or no when Volgin commanded him to speak or break. But we ended up removing this feature because of things going on in the real world. We had to tone
Uy, él es muy Georgino con ojos azules.
things down in terms of violence. What was happening in the real world were the headlines about the CIA and all the things they'd been doing to acquire information from their enemies. So Kojima decided it was best to cut the scene down to its bare essentials. I'm David Hayter. A few months ago, I hosted a video on this channel
¡Él es Snake! ¡Él es Snake, weón! ¡Él es David Hayter!
detailing content cut from the Metal Gear series. And today, we're gonna look at even more. Did you know gaming searched through thousands of magazines from all over the world looking for old interviews, archive footage, and combed through countless Kojima tweets so they could dig up even more ideas that for one reason or another didn't make the final cut. Some were victims of censorship, others got axed due to hardware specs, and in some instances, the discs just couldn't fit all of the content they'd already created. Like in the original Metal Gear Solid, it came with 30 virtual reality missions available on the start menu. But Kojima's team actually created about 60 missions. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough room left on the disc to squeeze them all in. A year later, they released an expansion disc with 300 VR missions. But Kojima originally wanted it to be 10 times bigger, and hundreds of missions that were already fully completed ended up getting cut. In the Metal Gear Solid Integral Strategy Guide, he said, "We originally talked about 3,000. How many was it we ended up making, including the ones we cut?" Then the VR director tells him about 500, I believe. We had a lot of free time when we were working on the European version, so we spent half of our time just playing around with the game. Then Kojima said, "I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but we just messed around with the original game while working on the other versions. We eventually started making new VR stages during our spare time, and before we knew it, we had a whole new set of them. So, I gave a presentation about it to my superiors where I said to them, I have a confession to make. This is what we've been doing all this time." They didn't look too happy about that, but they admitted it wasn't such a bad idea. And they then asked us to make it into a proper game. They go on to say they made a lot more mystery mode missions, but scrapped the most difficult ones, leaving only 10 on the disc. In another interview, Kojima said they wanted to add a versus mode, sort of a stealth game of hide and seek, but ultimately gave up on the idea. The game was already way behind schedule. Kojima told his superiors that Metal Gear Solid would only take a year to make, but active development dragged on for almost 3 years. And besides, even if they'd had all the time in the world, the disc was already packed to the brim.
Wow. Le lo que puse arriba.
Metal Gear Solid was released in Japan.
¡Qué paja! ¿Qué es lo que puede hacer el gallo que el humano no? ¡Tómalo con el pico! ¡Ah! ¡Gracias, Viña!
America and Europe, and became a bigger hit than I could have imagined. I was extremely pleased with its success, but I soon started to hear requests for a sequel wherever I went. I was planning to create a completely new game at the time, but I couldn't escape my fate. I would have to direct the sequel. After committing to Metal Gear Solid 2, Kojima dreamt up some ambitious ideas to make it bigger than the first game, but only half of them made it into the final release. Even the game's opening moments got cut. Sons of Liberty blew everyone's minds when it was revealed at E3 2000, and magazine interviewers flooded Kojima, all trying to get their 15 minutes with the man. In a few of those interviews, he said AI would study your actions during the first few minutes of gameplay, then use that data to detect your age, gender,
Ahora pasa la mano para depositarte Lucas 9.39 pesos. Culia se va a quedar
and
pobre.
personal interests. Different people would receive a different experience for the rest of the game, like how much blood, gore, and graphic content it would expose you to. Presumably, that meant a grown man would have a more M-rated
¿Y por qué no podemos verle el pico al rey de mejor o eso sería mejor, la verdad?
than a preteen would get. But even at its big reveal party, Kojima was already saying the PS2 wasn't powerful enough to realize all his grand ambitions, and some journalists suspected the AI opening was one of the ideas that wouldn't make the final cut. They were right. The closest thing that made it in was just directly asking the player for their info, which only affected the ending. The data appears on Raiden's dog tags, then he throws them away, discarding the identity of the player so he can form his own identity. Talking to the official Czech PlayStation magazine, Kojima said they were considering ideas to make use of PS2's internet functionality, and that Sons of Liberty probably would make use of them. He went into more detail a few months later, saying, "We do have plans for internet features, but it's really up to Sony to realize these network systems. The first, basic step would be to implement a system whereby players could exchange weapons via the internet. My favorite idea is to have an AI program, or even a real person to play Colonel Campbell or Mei Ling. They would monitor everyone playing the game, see how well or badly they're doing, and start giving advice on how to proceed in the game. They could even give tips on life and answer all kinds of questions. Obviously, our programmers are the ones who create the algorithms of the enemies and boss characters, so it would be fun if they could actually control these characters in real time and fight the player." Talking more to the Czechs, Kojima said he also hoped to incorporate voice recognition. The magazine mentioned that Sony was working on that technology for PS2. Kojima was well aware of that fact, saying, "Yes, I would like to incorporate voice recognition technology into my game. For example, it would fit perfectly into Metal Gear. It would be enough to shout a command." The PS2 stealth game, SOCOM, later came packaged with a headset. You could play online and talk to your squad mates, or you could play offline and issue commands to AI companions. But it sounds like Kojima had something different in mind. Instead of directing teammates, players would control Raiden with their voices. Kojima had actually been talking about using voice in place of buttons since he finished MGS1. He lamented that controllers had too many buttons, and too many actions had to be assigned to each one. It was confusing, but more importantly, it wasn't immersive. He explained, "I don't want the game control to be too complex. Because it is an action game, I wanted it to be intuitive. In RPGs, you press a button and a window opens and you can choose an item. But I wanted to avoid this. Just one click activates some action. As a result, we ended up using every button on the controller, but once you get used to it, then it will be convenient. However, I do think there are too many buttons with current controllers, making the game..."
Kojima culiao psicótico, weón. Quería meter calete mierda al juego, weón. Y si no fuera porque Konami no lo dejó, weón. Quizás qué weá sería Metal Gear 1, 2 y 3, weón.
Difficult. Eventually, I would like to see a voice recognition controller to make
Sería
things
una
easier.
cosa,
Maybe he would have had us talking to our
una
TV,
cosa
saying things
poderosa.
like spray or answer the call.
Loca,
but we
loca.
like to think Kojima's a bit more imaginative than that. He was aware that many fans had issues with the button-mashing torture scenes, so perhaps some kind of verbal response could have replaced them, or talking out loud can take the player through different dialogue trees. That said, the only specific function Kojima described was in an interview with Australian...
Juicy Demon. Bienvenido al cuarto Rage, un lugar horrible. Soy el Führer. Ahora que lo pienso, ¿y eso qué aprendiste temprano? Porque quería, ¿no? Porque quería. ¿Algún problema?
Australian magazine Hayter about how players could say a character's name and the codec would call them hands-free. Kojima also mentioned an item that would have essentially needed 4 times the power of the PS2. He said, "In the initial stages of development, we invent the most outrageous weapons and items for the player to use. Unfortunately, many of them either take up too much of the console's processing power, or they ruin the game balance.
Si viene Max Payne, si viene Max Payne después de esto,
with a great feature now that I fear is likely to be taken out of the final version. It involves being able to place your own surveillance cameras at certain spots in the game and view them remotely. You have 4 extra screens, but that means 4 times the processing.
I don't understand nothing because I'm German, but I saw a game in Instagram and I had to follow. Welcome to the Fort Rage, camarad. Bueno, eso más que nada, weón, communism. But Fort Rage, Nazism. HH. HH.
He was right. The cameras didn't make it in, and even adding reflective surfaces forced Kojima to reduce polygon counts for characters and environments. At the next week's E3, just a few months before launch, MGS2's trailer ended with a classic "One More Thing." The spectacle of a flood ripping through the tanker as Snake sprinted to stay ahead of it.
¡Oh, verdad que sí, po! Eso no pasa en el juego nunca, weón.
But when fans finally got their hands on the long-awaited sequel, that entire sequence was notably missing. Kojima later explained the cut. Piper asked if he achieved 100% of what he wanted, and he told them, I was not able to do even half of what I wanted.
¿Qué?
Since this is an action game, I had to avoid designing situations which would result in any slowdown due to the PS2's processing speed. The PS2 is not the magic box. There was an event in the game in which you would try to move yourself through a flood. We really tried to include it in the game, but it ended up being dropped. He cut the flood escape at the last minute, but it still made it in as a cutscene. When Olga reveals her backstory and motivations to Raiden, you can see it in a flashback. There was going to be another sequence on the tanker where Snake swims underwater surrounded by sharks, and Snake would have to spill his blood in the right places to distract them so he could escape before drowning. Kojima described several other sequences with sharks, including a boss battle against a great white, but in the end, not even one shark made it into the final game. A few months after launch, series artist Yoji Shinkawa published an MGS2 art book, which was promoted with a lengthy online interview. Talking about an unused Antarctic snake design, Shinkawa said it was going to be a penguin suit.
Nah, loco.
That lets Snake breathe underwater. But transforming it from a concept into an in-game item would have been extra work that wouldn't have been worth it. Presumably, it would have come in handy in all those underwater shark and flood sequences. In our last video, we talked about a few cut characters, like Old Boy and Chinaman. But we missed one shown in this art book, Ed from the NYPD Bomb Squad. According to Shinkawa, it's actually Ed Brown from Police Knots, a game he and Kojima made for 3D. In Police Knots, Ed's part of the LAPD sometime around 2013, but later becomes chief of the Space Colony's Vice Unit. Meryl Silverberg got her start in Police Knots 2 as Ed's subordinate in the Vice Unit. So moving Ed into the Metal Gear universe would continue the tradition. MGS2 would have shown Ed Brown
¡Qué loco!
in his younger days in the NYPD's Bomb Squad, but that'd mean him dying a few years before the events in Police Knots, possibly creating some sort of time paradox. So he got replaced with Peter Stillman. There were also a few scenes left out, mostly for being a little too weird. In the final game, there's a soldier who can't hold his bladder any longer and pees over a fence, not realizing that he's soaking Raiden. The Colonel and Rose call to express their sympathy.
¿Te puedes mear en el no?
And tell Raiden to take a shower when the mission's over. On a Japanese talk show, Kojima said he wanted to add another scene to go along with it. This time, a guard backs up to a fence with his butt out, making the player think, oh god, is this guy about to blow mud all over me? But then, to their surprise, they just get peed on again. Kojima thought it was hilarious, but none of his developers would make it for him. They all pretended to be too busy. There was another scene he wanted to include right at the beginning, the first time Snake enters the tanker. As you walk down the corridor, you hear the suspense-building violin music from the movie Psycho. The violin sounds get louder and louder as you approach a door, making you think something terrifying is about to happen. When you open the door, bracing yourself for the worst, you find a guard playing the violin. It's just a gag, but it cost too much to buy a violin and do motion capture for it, so the scene didn't get made. On the game's 20th anniversary, Kojima tweeted out some memories of what it was like behind the scenes. In a codec call with Rose, Raiden reveals that he was raised as a child soldier and fought in Liberia's Civil War, and was shown Hollywood movies for image training. Kojima acquired real-life footage of a child soldier to use in the game, and edited it himself, but the footage was rejected by the ratings board and had to be cut.
No!
Kojima said there was one more sequence that pushed things a little too far and had to get dialed back. Right after Raiden reveals his dark childhood, he has to run through Arsenal
Sad.
Naked. The whole time he's been using his hands to hide his baby maker. But originally, if you fumbled in combat, then what should not be seen would be seen, and you'd immediately get a game over. But the biggest thing that almost got cut was not Raiden's penis. It was the entire game. In our last video,
Raiden Dick. Raiden Dick.
We talked about how large sections of the story were changed last minute because of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The original plot began with weapons and ended with half of New York's financial district getting destroyed.
¿Por qué este juego salió en...? ¿Cuándo salió este juego? Espérate. Metal Gear Solid 2 Release Date 13 de noviembre. Salió el día de... No. 9/11. Salió como 3 días después del 9/11. O... Salió como 3 días después del 9/11. Oh shit. Damn, Juicy, literalmente, damn.
After 9/11 happened,
Hard.
MGS2 was
Hard
deemed too
shit.
close to reality, and the story was revised to avoid controversy.
Sí.
Shortly after our video was published, more details came to light, thanks to the translation work of the Kojima archivist. In 2005, the Snake Eater Extreme box set was released in Japan, which included a behind-the-scenes book called The Shedding. Several pages are dedicated to 9/11 from Kojima's perspective, and how instead of making revisions, he originally wanted to cancel the game completely. In September 2001, development was
Lo quería cancelar por el 9/11. Loco.
pretty much finished, and 2 million Americans had already placed pre-orders. Then a staff member came to Kojima and shouted that something had crashed into the World Trade Center.
Perdón. Oh. Si soy down, ¿algún problema ahora? No, no sé, salió un par de veces después del 9 de septiembre, del 9/11 on.
A chill ran down his spine. He ran to the TV room and saw the plot of
Perdón.
the game playing out in real life.
So
I felt I could no longer release this game. The Twin Towers are clearly visible throughout the game, even in the polygon demo scene. We treated it as an iconic building. This was no longer a good idea. An emergency meeting was held the next day with an American lawyer to
Es que me pareció raro que le fallaras a la fecha.
advise them, and they feared releasing the game could provoke the terrorists to attack
Noviembre.
Konami, especially Kojima
A
and
ver,
his team.
noviembre,
They were afraid of the
septiembre,
US government,
november,
too, as
september,
Japanese news reported
one.
that ordinary citizens who criticized the Bush administration were losing their jobs and getting physically attacked. Sons of Liberty's villain was the president himself, and the script called him a terrorist. In Hollywood, war movies and action films with controversial themes were getting canceled left and right. Kojima wanted to follow suit. I personally thought MGS2 should not have been released. I even intended to quit the company. It was only 2 or 3 years of hard work, but his team strongly disagreed and pushed back, and Konami's top brass had their back. Ultimately, all decisions regarding the American version were taken out of Kojima's hands, and hundreds of pieces were surgically removed. The game released in America 2 months after the attack, and to Kojima's surprise,
Es que claro, weón, hacer un juego sobre conspiraciones, weón, y que en una parte se estampen, o sea, en teoría se iban a estampar contra el World Trade Center. No, creo que sí que era el World Trade Center, weón, alguna wea así. 2 meses después del 9/11 era como, something smell like something sus.
he only got one complaint about ideology. It turned out most fans were actually pissed off that Raiden was the main character instead of Snake.
Claro, los weones estaban más preocupados. Los culiados estaban más preocupados de que Raiden fuera el personaje principal en vez de Snake.
That was the big controversy, which I kinda knew it would be at the time. Anyway, there were no terrorists
¿Qué
or
dijo?
controversy, which I kinda knew it would be at the time.
Esa fue la gran controversia. ¿Qué habrá opinado David Hayter de eso, weón? David Hayter habrá sabido que literalmente su personaje en el segundo juego tiene como 3 diálogos.
Anyway, there were no terrorist or government attacks against Konami. Metal Gear Solid 2 went on to sell 7 million copies worldwide and
Caleta.
achieved critical acclaim as one of the most culturally influential games of all time.
Es tan influente, weón, que el Metal Gear 2 es tan influente, weón, que literalmente sigue vigente hasta el día de hoy, weón. Tú lo jugás hoy día, weón, y los temas que toca siguen en pie, weón. Y por eso es el mejor Metal Gear, weón. Estamos grandecitos, weón, para decir, no, es que me gusta Snake. La wea. El mejor juego, el mejor Metal Gear es el 2. ¡Oh, Nikita!
After
¿Sí o no?
Sons of Liberty's massive success, Kojima wanted to do something that had never been done before, a realistic jungle. So he took his staff into the wilderness for a few days so they could build the game from personal experience, which turned into a life-threatening
Y
experience
sí,
when some of
me
them
cansé ahorita del médico, puta, el león comiste.
got lost. They were trained in CQC by combat specialists who threw them around, knocked them to the ground, and chopped them with dummy knives. I think I was thrown
Quiero
around
volver a
30
jugarme el 3 original, weón, y pasármelo en European Extreme. A ver si puedo, weón. Lo intenté hace tiempo, pero llegué a la parte de Barcelona nomás, weón, porque era imposible, era imputamente imposible, weón, hacerlo bien.
times, one developer recalls. Another said they hit him so
Y ni
hard
siquiera por
he
el
almost
hecho,
broke
weón, de
his
que
bones.
aguantaran
The
caleta,
climax
weón, es
of
que
their
me veía y
training was
perdía.
when the MGS3 team split into 3 groups to sleep for the night.
Esta parte, esa parte, es la parte la parte de mierda, weón, del puente del tren, es imposible de pasar, weón. Si no veía un video, o lo hacís perfecto, weón. Es imposible.
Combat specialists surrounded each group in the darkness, threatened their guard with a knife, and took him hostage. Then, mock executed every last developer. After their school of hard knocks, Kojima's team threw out the MGS2 engine and built a brand new one from the ground up, specifically made for wilderness environments. They initially planned to
mira,
use
hicieron
a
una agua de cero. Los Julio bacán,
dynamic weather system. So even
Pensé
if
que
you
era el
stood
del
in
2. Qué loco, hicieron otro motor entero de nuevo.
one place, the weather would change over time. But the mechanic was eventually cut, so in the game's final build, every area has predetermined weather patterns. In a case of making things a little too realistic, Kojima originally wanted the sniper battle with the end to last longer than the entire rest of the game. He thought Sniper Wolf was too game-like, as she only appeared in a few spots and the duel was over quickly. So Kojima aimed to make Snake Eater's sniper duel more true to life. In a 2005 magazine commentary, he said, "I'm personally a fan of Stephen Hunter's novels, where you have scenes in the mountains where two snipers are hiding
El maestro francotirador y punto de impacto de Stephen Hunter.
and trying to find each other for days. That's something I wanted to do in MGS3.
¡Ah! Chino culiao falopero, weón. ¿Cómo queréis que peleara con Dien por 5 días, weón?
So finally, I get these two characters in the mountains hiding, with the end trying to ambush Snake. When I explained what I wanted to do to my programmers, I made them read Hunter's books. We also went into the mountains and did some real training. My final direction to my guys was, if there are 10 people that play this boss fight, I wouldn't mind if 5 of them hated it to the point of wanting to stop playing, as long as the other 5 fall in love with it. Which I did, by the way.
Claro. O la mano lo di ahí, literalmente.
Kojima wanted it to take 1 or 2 weeks of sneaking and sniping to finish the fight. 2 weeks in real life. After Kojima's program
¿Qué?
finished building it, they sat down to test it out, but were playing for hours and hours and couldn't find the old man even once. The whole team hated it and started booing Kojima, who finally accepted his vision wasn't going to work. Then they changed it into a much easier and shorter affair, the boss battle we know today. Snake Eater
Igual la del juego, el juego final está buena, weón. Diría que es la mejor. Sí. Porque si no sería la pelea con Ball. No, es que la de Ball no me gusta mucho, weón. Sí, es como la mejor, la de The End, weón. En Nicky es Nicky, weón. En Nicky versus Nicky. Porque los demás son como de Pain, de Zorro, la luciérnaga culiada también está buena, weón.
And mid-development, Kojima said players would probably get to operate at least some
Y
of
si
them.
no, esa es la pelea con The Boss.
Famitsu
Ese es el jefe
Weekly
final.
asked if Snake was going to be able to take control of aerial vehicles after he shot them down. Kojima said that was originally part of the plan.
La mejor de 10 es por 2 semanas que estiro la pata, weón. O una para que me mate. O una semana para que me mate.
Realized it might break the game if Snake could fly everywhere, so they stopped working on that mechanic. In the game's final build, Snake can't operate any vehicles. There were a few ideas Kojima considered, but by the sounds of it, not as seriously as others. In that same Famitsu interview, Kojima said they thought about letting Snake take enemy weapons, which is pretty standard in first-person shooters, but decided not to because it'd make the game unbalanced. He also considered Snake using mud to cool himself to avoid heat detection, as well as jumping in rivers to make attack dogs lose his scent. Kojima said, in films and novels, dogs lose track of who they're chasing when that person goes across a river. In reality, I've been told that this is not the case. At this point, I am still contemplating whether I want to make it realistic or keep the fictional flavor.
A ver, realista no es, weón. Hay un equipo de huevones con superpoderes, weón. Así que realista no puede ser, weón. Hay un conchito que lanza rayos por las manos. Realista no.
Mechanic didn't make it in, so apparently he chose to side with reality. The MGS 1 through 4 art book shows a few unpublished characters who appear to have gotten cut too early to be named, so they only got numbers.
Yo tengo ese, weón.
Like the Medusa-themed number 2, the tiny-handed number 3, and number 7 and 8, who look like they'd be more at home in Silent Hill than Metal Gear. The book also shows some early sketches of characters who did
mira The End, pero The End beta, yo creo.
Into the game, like a pre-wheelchair eye patch wearing The End. There's also a middle-aged version of the Fear, who the book notes has some African blood. Probably the weirdest concepts are for the pain, with one wearing a GIMP mask and another simply labeled
Fetish Slave Mask. Bien, máscara de una máscara de BDSM que sea un negro o que sea un soldadito. Yes.
Black Man style. Then there's the boss, who's got a tattoo
¿Y por qué está en pelota?
of a snake on her chest. According to Kojima, she was a mentor, a lover, and much like a mother to Snake. They had a very complicated connection, but I knew that I would have to emphasize the maternal aspect more than anything. So when designing the boss, I imagined a mother with one breast out feeding her child, a kind of mother-son nuance. So even with her breast exposed, she would enter battle. When I first designed her, in the area around her chest, she had a tattoo of a snake, so when firing a gun, her breast would shake, making the snake look like it was laughing. There would be this legend that when you saw the laughing snake, your life would soon be over. But the tattoo and its backstory ultimately got cut and replaced with a snake-shaped scar from a cesarean section she had while giving birth in World War II. The climactic ending with Snake and the boss was revised as well. It seems this was a pretty late change, as the English voiceovers were already recorded. In the final game, these are her last words.
There's only room for one boss and one snake.
But unused audio on the disc reveals it was originally going to play out a little differently, seemingly with the player in full control, able to move and aim at will, as the boss begs Snake to end her life.
Shoot me. Come on. Shoot me. What are you waiting for? Just do it. Shoot me. What are you aiming at? I'm here. No. Shoot me.
Oh.
Do it right. What are you doing? Get it right this time.
Ultimately, the player's freedom and all that begging got cut, and the player only has control over the trigger.
Damn!
After Snake Eater's development was almost wrapped up, a few changes were made between the Japanese and English versions. It was the first game in the series to drop an F-bomb, but only in Japan. It happens when Dolgan calls Eva his precious little pet. Then she hits him with a big F-U. Here's the Japanese version.
なんだ言いたいことでもあるのか
Jódete.
Here's the toned-down English version.
Do you have something to say to me?
Go to hell.
Later games weren't so shy about dropping F-bombs, but things were different back in the early 2000s. Post-release, a couple dozen new camo designs were made available for download. Most of them were eventually added into Subsistence and the
Oh, Camaleón, Underground, Yadobashi, Grenade, Water Snake, Arco Iris, Momia, Año Nuevo. Este de Alemania, sur de Alemania, Sakura, San Valentín. ¡Hay una de Santa! Mira, Eden. O sea, no se ve, pero es como un Snake amarillo raro, ¿eh?
HD edition. But 4 camos were only available in Japan, like the E/Den camo, designed by manga artist Takayuki Mizushina to make Snake look like a hippie. Also, the New Year's with a rising sun representing the Japanese concept of a New Year's beginning. And the Yodobashi camo, based on the Japanese retailer Yodobashi Camera Company. They were all included on a 2006 bonus disc distributed by the Japanese magazine Dengeki PS2. But the most difficult to obtain was the Wonder Goo camo. You had to go to a Japanese Wonder Goo store where they had a machine that uploaded the camo onto your PS2 memory card. None of these 4 camos were ever made available outside Japan. A year after Snake Eater, MGS3 Subsistence released and came with a new PvP mode called Metal Gear Online. Kojima originally wanted to include some girls from Dead or Alive as unlockable characters, but the producer of the wrestling series Rumble Roses asked if they could collaborate someday. Kojima would have preferred girls from Dead or Alive, but Rumble Roses was also owned by Konami, and he felt kind of obligated, so he added a couple Rumble Roses girls instead. If not for that, Metal Gear Online might have looked something like this. But arguably, the biggest piece of content was cut in 2012, when Snake Eater got a 3DS remake. It added a few new features like the camouflage photography system that let you take pictures in real life and turn them into custom camos. But in 2017, a data miner called Pliskin Hunter stumbled over an entire mode cut in development, Extra Ops. Peace Walker released a couple of years earlier and released 128 extra ops that were essentially VR missions, with objectives like eliminating every soldier in a given area, rescuing hostages, and getting from point A to point B with perfect stealth. Each mission only took a few minutes, but at the end, you got a ranking based on your performance, so there's a lot of replayability if you wanted to chase S ranks. What Pliskin Hunter discovered was 69 brand new extra ops that were intended for Snake Eater 3D. Yeah, 69. A fitting name for a game called Snake Eater. We got in touch with Pliskin Hunter, who was kind enough to share some info and rehack his game to get this footage. There were 4 ingredient capture operations, 4 animal captures, 4 eliminate enemy soldiers, 4 eliminate enemy in the time limit, 4 one-shots, 5 pantry demolitions, 4 armory demolitions, 5 perfect stealths, 5 true perfect stealths, 4 holdups, 5 claymore disarmaments, and 5 attack chopper battles. There were also 16 boss extensions, 2 each for Ocelot, the Pain, the Fear, the End, the Fury, Volgan, the Shagohod, and of course,
the boss.
With hacking, a lot of these extra ops are fully playable, but they're clearly unfinished. For example, there's no proper menu system, and when you complete a mission, you're immediately booted out with no fanfare. And instead of a ranking, there's just a placeholder that says Result Test. If Extra Ops mode was finished, it would have added quite a few hours of extra content, and done even more to make Snake Eater 3D the definitive MGS3 experience.
Snake.
No! No!
Snake. Snake.
No, gracias. Ojo, Peace Walker. Ojo, Peace Walker. Hazlo Portable-Ops. Oh.
Portable Ops follows Big Boss 6 years after the events of Snake Eater, but the game was initially conceived with a completely different premise. We recently spoke with Ryan Payton, who worked on the game, and he told us the original idea was a PSP game that let you relive the series' history through a gauntlet of boss battles. The game would have run on the Subsistence engine and focused on local and online multiplayer. He said those initial ideas probably only survived for a month or two in terms of it being more boss-focused. This is just my interpretation of what was going on in those early days, which was, how do we create an authentic Metal Gear experience for PlayStation Portable that satisfies fans, perhaps more than the Acid series up to that point? And also, how do we get that game out the door fairly quickly? So the idea was to dust off existing boss battles and add some co-op elements to it as well. But those ideas didn't last very long, because we quickly pivoted towards what ended up becoming Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops. After they changed the game's structure, Portable Ops was developed in just a single year, so there wasn't much time to ruminate on huge ideas. Also, Kojima wasn't as closely involved in the project, so compared to the rest of the series, there wasn't the deep well of ambitious concepts for us to detail here. But there were a few interesting regional differences. Portable Ops had a feature that required a GPS peripheral. The game told you to go to specific real-life coordinates, and there you'd be rewarded with special soldiers. Ryan told us that Kojima likes to make use of every feature offered by a console, and this geocaching mechanic was right up his alley. Unfortunately, the GPS was only released in Japan, so Western fans never had access to the feature. There were also 8 soldier types you could only unlock by visiting Japanese stores like Wonder Goo, who'd worked out a promotional agreement with Konami. Metal Gear games usually released in Europe a few months after the US and Japan, so sometimes Konami gave them extra content to make up for it. For Portable Ops, European versions got a new boss rush mode, 2 more multiplayer maps, additional soldier types and careers, and 5 extra spy reports. So not only did America get less content than their friends across both oceans, but because of all the regional differences, nobody got the full experience. And with so many of those online nations no longer in service, a big chunk of Portable Ops is completely inaccessible, and much of the game is essentially lost to time.
Nah, loco. Crazy.
What do you mean?
Why are you here?
Oh, well, I was hoping to promote my new movie. I'm just coming off of the set.
No, David Hayter. Why here? Wearing an eye patch.
I'm Snake. Metal Gear 4!
For the franchise's big finale, Kojima dreamt even bigger than he had before, and his early vision was completely different from the game that hit store shelves 3 years later. He said other PlayStation 3 games were just evolving the graphics, not the gameplay. Kojima wanted the next generation to push 3D into 4D, with a realistically recreated
¿Cómo que el 4D,
ecosystem.
weón?
Every tree would grow from a seed, shed its leaves, and then die. There should be life in that tree. If we water the tree, it will grow. If we burn the tree, it will die. I want to create this kind of simulation world. He laid out his vision for Metal Gear Solid 4 in a lengthy interview in EGM. I would like to create something that we hadn't seen before. Up to today, creating games was almost like creating a set for the movies. We have a set in a studio, but a set is a set. There's nothing behind that, it's hollow. And also, everything is completely fake. It looks pretty, it looks like the real thing, but it actually isn't. Some creators might think, how can I expand my set and make it bigger?
Hijo de... ¿Cómo se le guarda tanta mierda a Kojima, weón? ¿Qué? ¿Pasa encocado, weón, 24/7 el hijo de puta, weón? Es que yo no entiendo. Yo no entiendo el culiao cómo se le guarda tanta mierda.
How can I make it a bigger world is what a typical creator would think. Even if you do that, though, I think that's not
Kojima un
meaningful, because
fumeta,
a set
weón.
is a set. The trees are still plastic. Everything is still a fake. Although you try to enhance the look of the jungle, everything is a fake. I would like to go after the real. I would have the trees with life inside. So if you water the tree, it will grow. If you don't water the tree, it might die. Then I would ask the users, why not play hide and seek in that real jungle? A core theme he brought up again and again was creating what can't be seen. In short, while other studios were improving their games with next-gen graphics, Kojima was evolving the gameplay by focusing on the invisible. But those ambitious goals bear little resemblance to what MGS4 ultimately became. Looking back after release, G4 asked Kojima if his original vision was different to the final product. He said, there were differences from the beginning, when we started in the concept stage to the final product. But in the midst of development, when we saw the actual PS3 and its limits and things like that, we changed our vision and goals. At the beginning, we only heard rumors about the machine, that we could do anything on it, that it was a monster machine, and so we set our dreams too high because we believed it could do anything. But when we saw the actual machine, of course, there are a lot of limits to it, and there were things we could do and could not do. It wasn't about the PS3's power, it was us dreaming too big. A couple more examples he described from that unrealized ecosystem was if you burn something, the chemicals affect other parts of the environment. Or if water spilled on the grass, at some point a flower would bloom in that exact spot.
Claro.
Another core concept was Snake playing 3 nations against each other.
O hermano, si Kojima hiciera un Metal Gear para PC, weón, ¿qué weón no haría con Chitumare? Si el Kojima hiciera un Metal Gear exclusivo de PC, weón, ¿qué mierda no haría con Nvidia y con AMD, weón? Oh, con Chitumare, weón.
Concept pretty in-depth in our last video, so just to sum it up, Kojima said you could ally with countries A, B, or C, or go lone wolf. If 2 countries in a
sobre
particular
todo ahora con la IA, weón. Es que Kojima, Julio, ¿qué mierda haría con la IA, weón, en los
one
PC?
against the other to wipe them out, so only friendlies were left in the vicinity. Or you could just wait until both sides wiped each other out for sort of an easy mode. Play your cards wrong, and you'll have both of them against you. Hard mode. If one army gets destroyed, maybe they're missing from a later area they would have otherwise occupied. Whose side you were on was constantly changing based on your own decisions, which would have made the game highly replayable. Kojima also said the maps would be huge, the size of brain-fed auto environments, and full of all kinds of nooks and crannies, but they'd be much more fleshed out. He pointed to the houses in GTA, saying they're empty and lifeless, but in the new generation of Metal Gear, people actually lived in these houses. They had a life. Civilians and bystanders, he hinted, might even take up arms to protect their families. Another feature, touted as early as the very first trailer, was no place to hide. Kojima said they wanted to make most of the game world destructible, and in some areas, pretty much anything could be destroyed. But in the final game, destruction was minimal and mostly pre-scripted. However, only shadows of those ideas made it into the final product. Kojima blamed the PS3's lack of power, and also said he regretted getting distracted with his management duties in the newly formed Kojima Productions, which at the time was developing Acid 2.
¿Qué es esa? Hermano, ¿hay un Metal Gear por turno?
Portable Ops Plus, Metal Gear Online, and 2 digital graphic novels. He told Edge magazine he wanted MGS4 to take 10 steps forward, but to his disappointment, it only managed to take 1 step forward.
El juego de cartas,
The
loco.
gameplay wasn't up to Kojima's standards either, but that was a matter of development talent rather than hardware restrictions. Just before MGS4 hit store shelves, he said, "I thought Assassin's Creed was brilliant because it really fulfilled the basic concept that MGS4 had at the beginning, how you could go anywhere in the environment and also you could climb anywhere, run anywhere." At the beginning of the concept, Metal Gear Solid 4 had motion blending, meaning if you push down a direction, things go automatically and seamlessly. If a bullet comes, you don't have to manually dodge, but the motion dodges and happens naturally. We kind of gave up on this because it was just too difficult, but when Assassin's Creed came out, we saw that they accomplished what we were really aiming for at first. I have to tell you that my staff and I were really low for the next 3 days after it came out. Assassin's Creed was Kojima's favorite game there for a while, so much so that he eventually
¡Ay, le puse el skin de Altair! ¡Hijo de
added
puta!
Altair's cloak into Guns of the Patriots as a DLC. Those were the big ideas,
Go.
but a few small ones got cut as well, like PS3 to PSP connectivity. At E3 2005, Kojima told interviewers that MGS4 would connect with Acid 2 in some way. He later said he wanted to connect with portable ops to trade soldiers between games, and was also considering letting players, maybe even a second player, control the Mark II with a PSP. Kojima tried to implement drivable vehicles in the previous game, and he was even more enthusiastic for them in Guns of the Patriots. He was a big fan of Halo 2, and pointed out that in all the popular games, players can drive pretty much anything, and yes, they were going to try and let Snake do the same in MGS4. None of those ideas made it in either. After release, Kojima told a Chinese magazine that they originally planned to include 108 weapons, but only ended up with around 70.
¿Cómo?
108's a very specific number, especially since Kojima didn't seem to remember the exact number that actually made it in. 108's also a culturally significant number, which might have been why it was the initial goal. At year's end in Japan, a bell's rung 108 times in Buddhist temples to close out the year and open the page on a new chapter. Each ring represents one of 108 earthly temptations a person has to overcome to achieve nirvana. And thus, the 108 weapons represent Snake's battlefield temptations, juxtaposed against the game's final message to decide with them and live.
¡Con el Sekiro!
Nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source? My source is that I made it the f up.
Ese es el Maxer. Sacó un clip del video del Maxer, weón.
Okay, yes, I am speculating on the meaning, but Kojima did say they originally wanted Snake to have 108 weapons. In another interview, Kojima also said he was considering letting players trade weapon customizations with each other online, but that didn't make it in either. Another more bizarre idea, which was probably never going to happen, was Kojima's desire to incorporate smell and even taste into his games. Before the 6-axis controller was revealed to
Ya, pero eso es como medio imposible por ahora. Todavía es como medio imposible añadir como olor y sabores,
he
weón.
told PSM Russia, if the PS3 comes with a controller that allows you to smell or taste things, that would be wonderful. I am interested in what new experience I can give to the user through all this. The problem is that most games
Ya
limit
metió
you
escaneo de
to using the
pies.
TV and the console's
Ya, no.
joystick. Personally, I think this is a fundamentally flawed practice. Everything that surrounds the player in one way or another, his whole room even, should be involved in the process. He'd actually been talking about the idea as far back as MGS1, but even if he couldn't incorporate smell, he did make the player's room part of the game.
¿Qué pasó entre Metal Gear 2 y Metal Gear Solid, weón? Pa' que Kojima culiao fuera literalmente un psicótico de mierda con ideas culiadas muy raras, weón.
Like switching the controller port in the fight against Psycho Mantis, and using the back of the real-life CD case to find a codec frequency. In fact, smell had been on Kojima's mind even before the first Metal Gear. In his 1988 game Snatcher, he wanted to coat the disc with blood-scented paint, so when the console got hot, it would melt and players could smell the murder scene. But, up till now at least, he'd never been able to realize his decades-long dream of a smellable game. And of course, it wouldn't be Metal Gear without a little censorship. When asked if Snake's injections were a gameplay mechanic, Kojima said no. It has a little bit of friction against first-party Sony rules. At first, I had plans to have this injection as a player's item, but with the ratings, and even team members questioning that direction, we decided not to do that. Apparently, Sony wouldn't tolerate performance-enhancing injections as a playable item, so they were downgraded to a plot device. At a signing event, Kojima revealed that the Beauty and the Beast...
No a la droga, no a la droga. Kojima dijo, no a las drogas. Kojima, con las drogas no. Falopa no. Falopa no.
Tours were originally going to appear buck naked, and Yoji Shinkawa mentioned that in preparation, they had the actresses do motion capture in the nude, but they couldn't use it in the final game. There was also a subplot in the Naomi tracking sequence where enemy soldiers left a trail of women's clothes, leading you in the wrong direction. At the end of the trail, you'd eventually find a naked female soldier. But that got cut as well. When we talked to Ryan Payton, he described a cut sequence intended to fit between the Big Mama motorcycle chase and running into Liquid. He said, there were some things that definitely fell on the cutting room floor, including a sequence in Eastern Europe. There was an underground tunnel sequence that players would go through with Big Mama as a kind of an escort scenario. That was cut fairly late in the process.
Debe ser raro, weón. Debe ser raro para Snake en el 4 haberse topado con su mamá, weón. Literalmente. Debe ser como, oh, mira Eva, hola mamá. Hola mami.
So I always thought if there was ever a Metal Gear Solid 4 Substance version, maybe the team would dust that off. It was probably 60 or 65% complete, and part of the reason it got cut was because it was behind schedule. You were escorting Big Mama in a callback to
Papá quiere matar a mi hermano y a mi papá. Quiero matar a mi hermano y a mi papá.
When you were helping Eva, who was injured after a big motorcycle sequence. So here you were helping an injured Big Mama go through the underground after this big epic motorcycle chase as a callback. You can see the cut in real time when Snake and Big Mama crawl down a manhole into a tunnel, walk about 50 feet, and then turn right, and they're already outside. The tunnel was originally a lot longer, and that's where the sequence took place. By the way, I'm David Hayter, the guy narrating this video. Some of you may not know, I was Snake.
¿Cómo es David Hayter? No sabía, chat. ¿Cómo es David Hayter?
Snake's voice actor. We actually recorded about 4 minutes of dialogue for that sequence. Here's a few small pieces.
Otacon, this place is crawling with rats.
What, you were expecting a more vermin-free underground waterway?
Something's weird about the way they're moving. First the birds helped me out in South America. Now it's the rats' turn.
You've got to inject Big Mama with the nanomachine suppressant. Snake, what are you killing rats for? Torturing small animals is a sign of a warped mind, you know? Leave them alone and get back to helping Big Mama, all right?
Ryan also told us that there were some ideas the staff had to cut due to time constraints, and as they were cutting them, the developers were saying, well, maybe this could get brought back in an eventual MGS4 Substance version, like the tunnel sequence. And Ryan also talked about fleshing out moments that happen off-screen, like what the Rat Patrol was doing behind the scenes in the Middle East. But after development was finished, the team shifted hard into Peace Walker and developing the Fox engine, so that definitive edition never got made.
Te odio, Metal Gear Peace Walker. ¡Oh, el Rising también! ¡Ojo!
If it was up
Uso
to
una cámara
Kojima,
externa a la virtual de Twitch, a veces en el Twitch. Uso el iPhone para capturar el tracking del modelo.
Raiden's hack and slash spin-off wouldn't have starred
Lo
Raiden
conecto por
at all.
internet.
I wanted to go for Frank Yeager or Gray Fox, but if we had gone with that, I would have had to write the script and then be really committed to creating the game. I want to pass game development to the younger generation in my team, and have been trying to do so for quite some time.
Oh,
they wanted to
pobre
come up
culiao,
with
no
a really
tenés
cool
po.
hack and slash title with some katana action and Raiden in it, and I thought, okay, that's fine. I respect it. A month after launch,
tracking
Konami
es
released
mejor.
a DLC pack made up of 30 new VR missions, but the Japanese version of the DLC gave fans something other regions didn't get. A wooden sword called Hebi Damashi, which means snake soul. Canonically, it was forged through the latest advancements in spiritual technology in order to pass on the wisdom of the legendary Solid Snake to future generations. Snake's Japanese voice actor, Akio Otsuka, recorded new voiceover for it, and the sword talks to Raiden as he fights with it.
¿No había un logro de pasar su nivel sin matar a nadie en este juego? Y creo que era con esta espada. No sé, no me acuerdo.
If it had been localized into English, I guess it would have sounded something like this. Cardboard, huh? You get it, don't you, Raiden? It must be used with care. Devotion. You need to love the cardboard box. You can't just handle it roughly. No man who loves cardboard can be bad. This isn't training. This is life.
Ningún hombre que ama las cajas de cartón puede ser malo. Coño, te va a levantar con un... Tengo un trípode puesto enfrente de mi cara. Tapa como una parte del OBS, pero no importa mucho, la verdad.
Death. There are no heroes out here. If you lose, you die for nothing. That sword was the only part of the DLC that didn't release outside Japan, and other than Snake's voice, it was functionally identical to the standard wooden sword available worldwide. So it seems the voice was probably the reason it didn't get localized, since it was only a few months before.
Ah, verdad, porque que cambiaron a David Hayter, weón, por el Kiefer Sutherland en el 5 y en el Ground Zero, weón.
Ground Zeroes. I don't know for certain, but I can't tell you for a fact that I didn't record voiceover for it. And I don't remember ever being asked to either. It's been like 10 years though, so it's possible my memory's a little fuzzy. Y'all know I do stuff besides just voice Snake, right?
Mentira, no, voz de Snake nomás.
Buy Wolves on DVD. As far as Rising though, I guess you could say an entire game got cut. Metal Gear Solid Rising was scrapped almost entirely when Platinum Games took over and transformed it into Metal Gear Rising Revengeance. But did you know gaming will be covering Rising at some point, including some new information never made public? So we'll leave.
Sí, es que el Rising original se veía muy lento, weón. Estoy bien. El Rising original se veía muy lento, era raro.
That topic for another time and move on to the final game discussed in today's video.
Se veía como más dinámico, sí, pero era como muy lento. ¿Se acabó o no? ¿Ya se acabó? ¿O todavía queda algo del 5 y del Ground Zeroes?
Yeah, let's not do this one actually. It's already been done to death. Hey guys, let's do the wild geese thing. Yeah, I know we said we weren't going to do that one. Let's do it anyway. Okay, cool. In 1978, a movie you've probably never heard of, The Wild Geese, released in theaters. Some mercenaries are hired to infiltrate a military base in Zimbabwe, Africa, and extract a political hostage so he can be exchanged for access to Zimbalan copper mines. The mercs are hired by a merchant banker, Sir Edward Matheson, who's sort of the movie's big boss. They halo jump into Zimbabwe. Sir Edward Matheson, who's sort of the movie's big boss. They halo jump into Zimbabwe, but they're vastly outnumbered, so they have to use stealth to silently kill the enemy soldiers. The mission's successful, but just as the mercenaries are about to make their escape, the big boss betrays them and is revealed to be the real villain. Their plane flies off without them, leaving the mercs totally screwed in the middle of nowhere. Hideo Kojima loves this movie, and the story appears to have inspired some elements of the Metal Gear franchise. The original 1987 Metal Gear was initially conceived as a game about a prisoner of war trying to escape, but during development, transformed into a game about Special Forces infiltration. In a series of tweets in 2011, Kojima revealed that at that point in time, he wanted to make Metal Gear into a team infiltration game, just like the Wild Geese. But the MSX wasn't capable of making Kojima's idea into reality, so he had no choice but to make Metal Gear a one-man-against-the-world affair instead. If the MSX was a little more powerful, or if Metal Gear was made for different hardware, it would have been a completely different kind of game, and consequently, the entire series would have been different. For the past 35 years, underpowered hardware...
Imagina si Metal Gear 1, Metal Gear original del MSX hubiera salido en Play 1. Imagina cómo estaría una Metal Gear, weón. Si Kojima se hubiera esperado un par de años y hubiera sacado Metal Gear en la Play 1 en vez de la MSX, weón. Ojo. ¿Cómo estaría, weón, cómo estaría, weón, la franquicia hoy en día?
Hardware's prevented Kojima from making Metal Gear games he dreamed of making. But from the very beginning, we have underpowered hardware to thank for giving us the Metal
Porque
Gear
ahora el
franchise
5 hubiera salido como en Play... En Play 5, ponele, weón. Ponele que el 5 hubiera salido con puto Play 5, weón. Y el 4 hubiera sido de Play 4, efectivamente.
today.
Y el 1 de Play 2. Sí.
We have more Metal Gear content like this coming up, so subscribe if you don't want to miss it. Until then, did you know Kojima wanted to let Snake name individual rats and keep them as pets in MGS1?
¿Qué?
If you want to see more Metal Gear Cut content, or a story about Phantom Pain, we...
No quiero ver más, no. Si veo más me voy a morir. Era mucho. Estuvo bueno el video, weón. Estuvo bueno el video, hermano. Video culiado bueno. Voy a guardarme los otros para verlo después, weón. Gaming, weón.